Hi everyone, and welcome to Chapter 7, Transport of Water from Soil to Leaves. Now, last week we sort of mentioned that plants have to transport a couple of things. They transport gases, they transport products of synthesis, mineral ions, and water. Gases can be transported via simple diffusion, whereas water, ions, and products of photosynthesis, for example, sucrose, will need specialized transport systems. And you already know what they are in very simplified terms. Water and ions are transported by xylem, whereas products of photosynthesis or assimilates are transported from source to sink by phloem. So today we're going to dive in deeper, especially into transport of water and ions, specifically from root to the atmosphere. Now you might see this complicated looking diagram in your notes. This is just for revision purposes, and we'll come back at the end of the chapter to just recap. Okay, so transport of mineral water, but no, transport of water and mineral ions. Now this is a similar pathway for both, and this is always from the root upwards. They differ a little bit, but we'll get to the details later. But mostly you can assume it's the same. The similar pathway for both, so it's going to be in the roots, and you can imagine the water going up the trunk, and then up the leaves, and then up into the atmosphere. Now, but of course, there are finer details to that. You learned the detailed structure of the roots, and therefore, let's do a more detailed flow chart, right? It goes from the soil, which is like outside there, root hair, which is part of the root, obviously, and then the cortex, which you can see here, the endodermis, and then only it goes into the xylem. And from the xylem, this is still in the root, okay? So in the root, the water enters the xylem, and this transports to xylem in the stem and xylem in the leaves, all the way upward through the xylem in the trunk. And then at the leaves, mesophyll cells would be having this water now. Some of it is used in respiration, and the rest is really released to the atmosphere through the stomata. So that's just the overview, but keep this vision in mind. Imagine you are water. You are water. And you are traveling from the soil to root hair cortex. And what pathways will you take? And how are you going to move upwards against gravity? That is incredibly insane. So let's start from the beginning. Let's start with step 1. Let's just talk about soil to root hairs. Now, before we get there, let's talk a little bit about the anatomy of this root hair and root. This is a longitudinal cross-section of the root. You can see here is the root cap. The root cap, by the way, is impermeable to water. The root is actively growing in this region, and it needs like quite a hard, tough tip in order to be protected and penetrate the ground. The root hairs, however, in this diagram, are permeable to water, unlike the root cap. And they are very, very fine. In fact, they're not even cells. They are actually long, thin extensions of epidermal cells. So you can see the epidermal cell here, the epidermis of the root, epidermal cell. And you can see it just has like a little thing that extends outwards here. Okay, water can pass through the cell wall and get into the cell through the root hair like this. Mineral ions are also taken up through here, but they can't pass through the cells because ions are charged, so they are taken up via cellular diffusion or sometimes even active transport into the root hair cell or epidermal cell. Okay, why do you need these extensions? Well, it's able to reach between the small spaces between soil particles. If you imagine soil particles as little like circles, there are tiny spaces between them. Those can reach in They're very delicate though, and has to be replaced after a few days. But the advantage is because it can reach between the spaces and absorb the water, it has a very large surface area. So this means that water can be efficiently moving into the root as an increased area of absorption. Okay, so this chapter we're going to talk a lot about water potential. After all, it is the transport of water, and water travels down the water potential gradient. So always think of the direction. So here we have the root hair cell here, and these circular things are the soil, and soil actually has a higher water potential than the root hair cytoplasm. So the water will move again from high to low, right, down the concentration gradient. Now, why is it that soil has a higher water potential? It's because the root hair cell, or the epidermal cell, has a high concentration of ions and organic substances. Remember, it can absorb ions by active transport, right? They do have that high concentration of ions and organic substances like proteins or sugars, and therefore it's lower than the outside. The water could diffuse down the water potential gradient from a region of high water potential to a region of low water potential via osmosis. Osmosis is a very important word. No, write on mark, like your test, right? So this is also through the partially permeable surface membrane. And again, partially permeable is another key word. Okay, so that is from the soil to the root hair. Now we're going to travel from the root hair cells into the cortex of the root. Okay, so again, water potential comes into play. Root hairs has a higher water potential than cortex. Water moves down water potential again, water potential gradient by osmosis again. Okay, so, but you know, it's not going to be that simple because there are a few possible routes for root hairs to cortex. Okay, imagine again you are water. There are a few ways. Number one is called the apoplastic pathway. Sounds complicated, but actually a very simple concept. Water can pass through the cell wall or intercellular spaces. So you can see here that the water is going into, not into the cytoplasm of the vacuole, but traveling at the cell wall, okay, between those cellular fibers. Why does water tend to do this? Because water actually has adhesion, forms hydrogen bonds with cellulose, and therefore can travel in this pathway. This does not mean, this means that water does not cross membranes and enter into cells. They are just between cells. That's why it's called intercellular spaces. If you are water, you can also travel using another way called symplastic pathway. Okay, symplastic pathway means that the water travels through the cytoplasm, and the water can travel cell to cell by plasmodesmata. So into the cytoplasm, and then you can see here between cells, it goes through the plasmodesmata. Plasmodesmata is where cytoplasms of the cell are connected. There is no cell wall. And the third one, which is very rare and also overlapping with symplast. So this is, if you see this, don't be scared because vacuolar pathway just simply means that water can pass through into the vacuole and then back outside. Now this is also a part of symplastic pathway, okay, a little bit different, but a part of it overlaps because, well, you need to enter the cell in order to travel through the vacuolar pathway. So vacuolar pathway always comes with symplast pathway. Okay, so how do you remember that? You might think, oh, it's quite hard, isn't it? Like apoplast, symplast, it doesn't make sense to me. Now, apoplast pathway or apoplastic pathway, it has an A, right? That's how I remember it. And cell wall has an A. So wall, apple, the A and A. Whereas symplast and cytoplasm both have like Y's in the front, C and psi. So I sort of think it makes sense. So this might be a way you can remember it. So that's from the root hair. You can see here, root hair, soil out there, goes in the root hair, goes in the apoplast or symplast. And then now it ends up at the endodermis. So from the root hairs, the cortex, now we're at this layer here, the second so-called second circle in the roots called the endodermis. Now this is when the apoplast and symplast pathway becomes different or changes a little bit. Why? Because the endodermis has a Casparian strip. What does that mean? The Casparian strip is because it's a suberized cell wall, or it's a cell wall made out of suberin. Suberin is a material, sort of like lignin, cellulose. Okay, so suberin is impermeable to water. Yeah, so and it's in the cell walls only, and it only has like a strip that looks like this. So it's like blocked in this region. So you can expect if you are water and you are traveling through the apoplast pathway, you won't be able to add the endodermis because that Casparian strip is impermeable to water. So apoplast pathway is blocked, and the only way for water to get in through the endodermis or cross the endodermis is through the cytoplasm, and this is called the symplast pathway. So all the water is forced into the endodermal cells as well as ions. Now, why is this important? Okay, this is important because if water and ions are forced to pass through, means it will pass through the cell membrane. The cell membrane has these transport proteins to control what mineral ions can come in and how much exactly. So transport of mineral ions can be controlled at the endodermis. At the specifically carrier proteins of the plasma membrane of the endodermal cells. Now, because these are mineral ions, again, they cannot pass through the cell surface membrane. They are absorbed by the transport and can contribute to something called root pressure. The root pressure is something we will cover next video. Stay tuned. Okay, so far we have the soil with the root hair, apoplast, symplast in the cortex. In the endodermis, no apoplast, just symplast. Now we can finally go through the xylem. Yay! So throughout this process, water continues to move down the water potential gradient. Okay, there is a lower water potential in the xylem and in the soil. Okay, so from the endodermis to the xylem, they have to cross something called the pericycle, which is a layer of cells just below the endodermis or just on the inner side of the endodermis. This can be through apoplast or symplast because it doesn't have the suberin cell wall here. Then, how does water get into the xylem vessels? Through the pits in the cell walls of the xylem vessels. Remember, xylem vessels are made out of, the cell walls are made out of cellulose and lignin again is impermeable to water. And these pits are not lined with lignin, and therefore water can pass through. So now we are in the xylem vessels, and the water has finally gotten into the roots, into the xylem vessels in the roots. In general, the roots have a higher water potential as well, and leaves have a very low water potential, so the water can travel upwards, again, down the water potential gradient from xylem, still inside xylem, from the roots into the stem, into the leaves, still in the xylem. So we went from xylem vessels to roots, from roots to leaves, and now we are at the leaves. What is happening here? So xylem has a higher water potential than its atmosphere, obviously. And water continues to move down the water potential gradient. As you know, there's a lot of ultrastructure. There's a lot of tissues in the leaves as well. So how many processes, how many sections or tissues does it go through in order to get to the environment? So here we go. Okay, you are water. And now that you are in xylem vessels in the leaves, you have to come out through the pits again because the lignin is impermeable, right? Come out through the pits of the xylem vessels. And what you will have there in the leaf in abundance is palisade or spongy mesophyll cell. Okay, it could come out and travel through those mesophyll cells by apoplast or symplastic pathway. But the final goal is for, of course, some water is using synthesis, but after they travel, those water will end up onto the surface of spongy mesophyll cell walls. Okay, they gather at the surface of spongy mesophyll cell walls. Then water on the surface, outer surface of the spongy mesophyll cell walls, this is in the airspace, right? This evaporates into the airspaces. So at first it's at the cell wall, then it evaporates into airspace. And then the water vapor, which is in the airspace, diffuses from the airspace via the stomata to the atmosphere. You might have trouble like visualizing that, so wait for next slide. Hang on. I just wanted to highlight that, hey, after evaporations, intercellular air spaces are also saturated with water vapor. Okay, the evaporation here causes it to be saturated with water vapor, and therefore the airspace also has a higher water potential than the atmosphere. Again, water is always moving down the water potential gradient. Okay, let's look at it here again. And let's talk about the same parts again. Okay, so processes. This is the xylem, and this is water moving out into the palisade or spongy mesophyll cells. Now, how does it travel through these cells? Well, by apoplast or symplast pathway. Okay, so how does one mesophyll cell go to next? How does water move from one mesophyll cell to another? Apoplast or symplast pathway. The same as you know. Then it gathers at the spongio mesophyll cell wall, cell surface of the cell wall, the intercellular spaces, like here the air space. And then only the water is evaporated into the airspace. It's not even out this airspace. Like evaporation occurs from the surface of the cell wall to the airspace. Then water vapor, okay, now is water has evaporated into water vapor. So water vapor doesn't travel by osmosis, it diffuses. It's not evaporation anymore because it's already evaporated. The water vapor diffuses in the form of gas into the atmosphere via the stomata, which is composed of two gut cells. So don't confuse these process names, as marks will be deducted if they are confused. Okay. So this loss of water is called transpiration. Why? So this is going to next video a little bit already, but I just wanted to tell you that, hey, it is the loss of water vapor from leaves, and yes, we can see here that water is lost through the stomata, but there's also another way of losing water. Okay, so let's do this again. Transpiration is the loss of water vapor from leaves. The side effect is that the plant cools down. It's just a side effect, just an additional bonus feature. There are two ways, and mainly is via the stomata, which involves the diffusion of water vapor from the airspace to the atmosphere. And this only occurs when the stomata is open. Why is it open? Well, stomata is open when photosynthesis is needed. Entry of carbon dioxide and exit of oxygen. Yeah? So when stomata is open, diffusion of water vapor can occur through the stomata. But what if when the stomata is closed? Is there then no transpiration? No. Transpiration is still occurring, but at a very small amount and very low rate of transpiration here when the stomata is closed, because water is lost via the cuticle. Okay, and cuticle is a mostly waterproof material. It's very hard for water to pass through, but sometimes a little bit small amount of water vapor gets through, and this also is transpiration. But mainly is the stomata. Now, more on transpiration next video. Now, just a recap of what we just did. Whoops, hang on a sec. I'm going to go back to this slide here. Now, don't worry about this slide. It is usually used for revision, but let me just use this to recap. Now, the water travels from soil to root hair down the water potential gradient. From the root hair into the cortex, symplastic pathway and apoplastic pathway is used. But at the endodermis, the Casparian strip is present, and therefore apoplast pathway is blocked, and symplast pathway is not blocked. It is open. And then it can go down the water potential again into the xylem. And from in the xylem, water is transported from the root to the stem to the leaves. These mechanisms for water to travel against gravity, we will actually discuss later. Okay, so this one, next part. But we know that in the leaves, again, from leaves to mesophyll cells, symplast and apoplast pathway are used for water to be transported between mesophyll cells, and then they use this pathway to get to the mesophyll cell surface. And after that, water evaporates into the airspace, and then water vapor diffuses out into the atmosphere through the stomata. And that's it for now. So we have part 1C on the way, and we'll do how does water move against gravity again, and what are the factors that affect transpiration rate. How to use photometer to measure the rate of transpiration, and how do some plants manage to survive in very, very dry environments. So that is for next video. Till then, see you and bye.